Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
This is Season 4, Episode 12, Blowing Smoke. This episode was written by Andre and Maria Jacques-Menton and Brett Johnson, and directed by John Slattery. It takes place in September 1965. This episode is so much about people cutting ties and other people clinging to connections, even, or maybe especially if those connections aren't good for them. There's an I can't quit you quality we're seeing here with Midge and heroin, with Sally, Betty, Glen, and Dr. Edna, with SCDP's clients, and Don and tobacco. And there's also a lot of plot in this episode. Usually I feel like there are more moments that breathe, but this one clicks along, and it also includes most of the characters from the Mad Men universe.
The episode kicks off with Don having his meeting with Heinz, which had previously been set up by Faye. Don's driving hard here, trying to solicit new business for the firm, which desperately needs it with the departure of Lucky Strike. But it becomes clear that the client isn't looking to make some sudden move here, and that's just not meeting with Don's timetable.
The actor playing Raymond Geiger from Heinz is John Sloman, and this is his most recognizable project, although he was also in General Hospital and an episode of Parks and Rec and some other things. I really enjoy how much this character is as passionate and knowledgeable about beans as Don is about good advertising. When somebody is really into something, even if you're not into that thing, I think that their passion for it is so intriguing. So when he says, there's a time for beans and there's a time for ketchup, or food is cyclical, or humor worked for pickles, but we can't do that with beans, I'm sort of catching his bean fever, I guess, as he's talking.
It's kind of tragic because it does seem like there's a real meeting of the minds here between Raymond and Don. He likes what Don has to say. He feels that Don is really hearing him as a client. So really, things go as favorably as anyone could hope in this particular encounter. But at the end of the meeting, Geiger isn't looking to make any short-term or quick change. And he talks about circling back in 6 to 8 months, which is another way of saying perhaps in the indefinite future. This is not helpful to Don and the firm in the short term at all.
Yes, this is the first of many breakups in this episode before their relationship really even gets started. The guy just can't risk doing business with Don right now, even though he'd like to. The way Don wants this to work so much reminds me of the flashback this season when Don is trying to convince Roger to hire him as an ad man. He will do anything, he'll say anything to make this work. As Raymond says, I bet I could get a date with your mother right now. And we also get our first truth call out in this episode. Raymond is very honest with Don about the time. He says it will take months to come on board. Don agrees that's true. And Raymond says, I'm just not sure your company will be around that long. And that's a kind thing of him, I think, to be honest, but it really does show Don how desperate their situation is. And he's not drinking during the meeting, but when he calls for the waiter at the close of the scene, I feel like it's clear he's going to partake.
Yeah, I don't know if it's especially kind by Geiger. I think he's just being straightforward and blunt here. He gives credit to Don for his ideas. And again, we get this sense that there is chemistry between them, but he's not going to make a move in the short term. And this is exactly what Don's seeking. There's no way to get cash in the door quickly, even if you land these new clients. So yeah, it's helpful in the medium term once you've got the client onboarded and spun up billings and you started to have some creative output that you're billing for. But none of this is helping in the short term. In effect, they need to hold their breath or breathe less quickly so the oxygen they have lasts longer. And that oxygen is cash. And this notion that you're going to create more oxygen by bringing in more business, yeah, in the long term, but it is not going to help you in the time frame they're talking about.
And the time they keep mentioning is 6 months. And they bring it up later where they say 6 months means never. And remember, they put Freddie Rumsen on 6-month leave. And It's just kind of an interesting little theme they have running through there. Also, in a mild spoiler of things to come, the setup for Raymond's tension with the ketchup department already exists here. So he's vinegars, sauces, and beans, right? Which I don't know why it's funny, but it just is. So already in this first scene where we first meet him, it's really kind of fun to see that brewing.
And then I think as well, and this is very common in Mad Men, we've got smart characters talking to each other. Mr. Geiger can detect the desperation on Don. He knows Don is desperate and hungry. Don's offering to discount his fees, which in the commentary, a couple of the advertising consultants mention, this is not Creative's place or job, but Creative wants to please the client. They'll do anything. We'll see echoes of this desperation later in the episode in other circumstances, and there's just no concealing it from any sort of observant, intelligent person.
I think that suggestion Don makes about reducing his commission, that's the point that triggers Raymond to say, "You're an idea man, let the account boys do this part." That's his mistake, right? Don doesn't know this part, and the desperation is in the way of what he does best. At Betty's house in the next scene, Jean is in a high chair banging a spoon, and I so appreciate the look Sally gives him. She's really over this. And when she asks Betty if she can take the spoon away, Betty goes, "The spoon or the screaming, take your pick." And this might not be great moments in parenting, but I have walked in Betty's shoes here. In my case, it was a road trip with a stuffed lamb that's saying Baba Lamb, like the Beach Boys' Barbara Ann. So you press its paw, but it would start over every time you pressed it. And we never made it through the whole chorus in an hour and a half. So I like the Beach Boys a little bit less today because I kept hearing that over and over. But again, the Baba Lamb or the screaming, take your pick.
And anybody who's been a parent can recognize the sort of awful options that you have, spoon or screaming in this case. In the scene, Sally talks about wanting to have dinner with Henry, and Betty sort of gives her, the child's answer about, oh, he eats different food. But Sally's quick to say, look, she'll try new food. She's saying she would like to eat with Henry. And this clearly pleases Betty.
Yeah, I think Sally wants to differentiate herself from the spoon banging crowd, and she's a breakup, if you will. She wants to establish herself as more of an adult and move away from Betty's view of her as somebody lumped in with Bobby and Jean.
The next scene is back in the Sterling Cooper Draper Price office, and Dr. Atherton's there talking to the principals. He's offering them the opportunity to make a pitch to Philip Morris. Through Dr. Atherton's connections with them, he knows they're about to launch a hot new brand for young women, and he set up a meeting for Sterling Cooper Draper Price to meet with Philip Morris, and this is a very juicy opportunity from their perspective.
I like when Dr. Atherton stresses the importance of signing new business. And Roger goes, "Yes, doctor, we know there's a black spot on the x-ray. You don't have to keep tapping your finger on it." And especially when they're talking about cigarettes, it's very on point. Dr. Atherton goes on to say that SCDP is a certain type of girl and tobacco is your ideal boyfriend. They already have a team in place. They know the rules and regulations. So it does make sense. But this particular company is not worth as much as Lucky Strike was. The best part of this scene is that you get to see all the meetings after the meeting. So Roger goes in and talks to Bert about going after the bigger accounts to replace what they lost instead of chasing this. Harry and Ken, of course, they're just worrying about their own career trajectories, and Pete and Lane talk about making cuts. And there's so much anxiety. Mad Men is great at helping us know these characters so well. We understand their individual concerns with very little dialogue. I think they just have one or two lines each. Ken is about to be married. Pete just had a baby. Lane moved his family back from England. So they all have these financial and family pressures. And it's also this funny kind of rewind because the music is the same theme that was playing when they introduced us to these new offices. So the scenes are jumping around from pair to pair, but instead of this swinging optimism, there's borderline panic.
We've emphasized the financial need of the firm right now to get new business in the door, but there's also just these sort of signs of vigor, signs of health benefit that if you could be in charge of the new brand, for Philip Morris, that would be a sign of a major player in the market who has confidence in your firm and is willing to give you this business. We can see Lane already starting to bring up that payroll is the problem. This is this major outlay of cash. It comes every 2 weeks, and they're going to need to have a solution in order to be able to fund that. And that means reducing the cost, which is reducing staff.
Next, Faye and Dawn have a quick meeting together in the office, and Megan is sitting at her desk in between them in the shot. Of course, Megan is watching Dawn have dinner plans with Faye and meeting with Faye after she slept with Dawn, so it has to be awkward for her. And you would think it would be awkward for Dawn, too, but this is a man who had dinner with his wife and the Barretts while he and Bobby and Betty were together, so I guess it doesn't bother him. I just remember Pete was twitchy when Peggy and Trudy were in the ladies' room together for a few minutes, so Dawn is
Yeah.
on a different level.
Yeah, Dawn seems just cool as a cucumber here, and we get no sense that there's any discomfort or unease on his part. In this scene, it's clear, Faye is so much on Dawn's side. She tells him how impressed Hines was with the meeting they had, even though from Dawn's perspective, it was completely unsuccessful in terms of his short-term goals. She's just 100% supportive of him in this moment and the stress he's under and his firm.
Next, we see Sally and Glenn meeting up in an outside lot. It's apparently a regular thing that they're doing. He's in a football uniform, and as usual with Sally, he's taking himself pretty seriously, and he's dispensing advice whether she wants it or not.
He's a confident young man, saying psychiatrists are easy to fool, offering her a cigarette, asks if Sally talks to her mom about him. There's a childishness to the conversation they're having and to Glenn's efforts to impress Sally. But it feels legitimate to me. It feels real. This is the way kids talk. This is the way kids try and impress each other. And it's clear they have a real friendship here and they enjoy each other's company.
I take from the writer's commentary that this relationship is supposed to be a friendship where Glenn is offering Sally useful counsel, like he's the real therapist. But I can't buy that because he's talking about himself more than he listens to her. He says several things that reveal something about him, but nothing that's terribly helpful to her. And where he says psychiatrists are easy to fool because he's been to one himself, Sally says Dr. Edna is smart, and this is an adult Sally admires. And Glenn's response is, so who's smarter, me or her? And Sally politely does not answer that. But I think if Glenn is a stand-in for Dawn, for Betty or Sally, making it about himself is a pretty on-track choice. I mean, that is always what Dawn does.
And just to give credit where credit is due, Dr. Edna is more educated than Glenn at this point.
I am so glad you pointed that out in case anybody was confused on that point.
Yeah, I just see him as sort of an appropriate childhood friend, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of romantic vibe here. So I get the sense Glenn is inclined in that direction towards Sally, but he's not really sure how all that works yet. I guess I'm buying what the writers say here. It seems to give it an innocence and childish friendship aspect.
Glenn kind of throws some shade to Dr. Edna, and then he does about Betty as well. He says that she doesn't like me, she thinks I'm, and I really would have liked to have heard what he was going to say there, but he stops and he says, she doesn't like kids. And we get a truth call out when Sally defends Betty. She says, that's not true. Although, a little bit, I'm afraid, Sally, a little bit.
Yeah, I think when we talk about Betty and her attitude towards kids, I guess I revert back to the narcissism of Betty. I'm not sure that she has anything against kids, but in the sense that kids aren't attuned to her needs and giving her what she wants. Yeah, absolutely. She has friction and frustrations with children because she struggles to get to bend them to her will in a way that in her life up to this point, I think she's had a lot of success leveraging her looks and charm to get other adults to pay attention to her in the way she wants to be paid attention to.
Next, we see Don in the lobby of his office building, and he runs into Midge. He seems really glad to see her, and he even says he thought he might run into her in the village sometime. He reveals he has his own firm, he's divorced, and she says that she's married, but it isn't to Roy, so we're not going to get a round two of that confrontation he and Don had in Babylon. Midge ends up inviting Don over for dinner. She says she'll cheer him up, and he can buy one of her paintings.
My recollection of Midge from when they broke up was that she had this array of men who were seeking her attention. So seeing her here in the lobby, I just assume that's the character that has re-entered Dawn's life in this moment. And it's only at the end of the scene when she asks for a ride downtown because she lost her purse. I get an inkling that something's not quite right here. And again, it's not that she looks bad, but she's not totally put together. I err on the side of saying, oh, that's just the way she dresses now or her style or whatever. But she does mention she's thin. What's exactly going on here?
I think when the audience sees Midge, we also realize how much has changed for Don Draper and how much has stayed the same. We met her in the pilot when Don was married with 2 kids. He was worried about his Lucky Strike presentation. He was secretly connected to Anna and Adam, and Roger was his boss. And now he's lost his marriage, Lucky Strike, Adam, and Anna, and he carries the responsibility of partnership with Roger. So on the surface, it looks like he is the same type of guy on a positive trajectory, but we know he's had a lot of losses since that pilot when we first met both of them.
And I guess it's a bit of a mistake on my part to assume Midge's life has remained constant, that there has been no evolution or change. But at the reintroduction of her character, I do default back to, oh, it's 2 minutes after they last saw each other and nothing's changed on her side, which seems foolish thinking about it, given how much has happened to Mr. Don Draper in that time.
Next, we see Sally at Dr. Edna's office, and she's talking about the mundane things that make up our lives and meaning. Her mother forced her to brush her teeth again, a second time. Sally understands now that it's Betty's need to control her. And she has the ultimate truth call out when Sally says about Betty, she doesn't care what the truth is as long as I do what she says. And that is such a tragic truth bomb, both because Sally has real thoughts and opinions and Betty won't entertain them, and because Sally has to be the adult and humor her mother even when she knows it's ridiculous.
In his commentary, Matt Weiner says that Dr. Edna is the best psychiatric worker in the history of the world. And it's kind of a sly reference to the collection of therapists, psychiatrists, and doctors we've seen through this point in the series. Our frustration at the way they treat their patients and the confidences they betray and all the rest of it. Finally, with Dr. Edna, we get an example of one who seems to be doing right by Sally. I feel very happy for Sally that she's gotten to this place, especially on the other side of the breakup of her parents, which is hard on any child.
I appreciate how calm Dr. Edna is, especially given what Sally's been through and how not calm her parents are. And I appreciate that Dr. Edna tells the truth without throwing Betty under the bus. She says, your mother acts that way because she has stresses, not because you did anything wrong. And that is so crucial for Sally to hear, and it's true. And I think Sally respects that. She's not being told to go watch TV, right? Somebody is really hearing her and saying something that's true. They have kind of a successful breakup here because Sally is changing and progressing and moving forward. So she says, we're going to drop your time to just once a week. And that means you have time to see friends and be in ballet. Then Dr. Edna tells Sally she's proud of her, which I don't think we've ever heard Don or Betty say to Sally.
I love the writing for Sally in this scene because I think it captures both the childishness of Sally's character, but also how adult she is and how she's starting to understand the world and people in a more sophisticated way. Children of this age really do have a foot in both worlds, and depending on the moment, they can find themselves pushed into one world or the other. But the reality is they're really kind of in both at the same time. And it really seems like Dr. Edna is a good fit for Sally. And we can see Sally's success in this navigation.
When we think about the adults in Sally's life, Miss Farrell and Grandpa Jean cared about Sally, but both of them had some issues. And Carla and Henry are both stable adults for Sally, but Betty can interfere with their advocacy. So even though I am not a real Glen fan, it does make sense to me that Sally would keep seeking viewpoints outside of her mother's reach because Betty is so controlling.
The next scene has Don Draper arriving at Midge's place, where he's introduced to her husband, Perry. The apartment looks a little run down. Perry himself has a, to quote Matthew Weiner, slightly slimy, slightly desperate manner to him.
Yes, they have this very awkward drink in the tiny kitchen, and it's like theater of people who entertain guests. Like, isn't this what normal people do? They have people over for drinks, but it's very uncomfortable, and you can tell that it doesn't happen very often. So Perry is being super friendly to Don in a slimy way, and he's pushing him to buy one of Midge's paintings. The showrunners did make an effort to have the paintings look really interesting. So Perry says, it's the after image. It's what she sees when she closes her eyes. And this season and series explores who is Don Draper. So for him to have a painting Midge creates with closed eyes, Don has always been pretty good at ignoring the truth. So everything about this seems really unhealthy.
We can also feel the desperation oozing off of Perry. And this really fits with the opening scene where it's Don who's desperate. And he handles it in a much more professional manner. The Heinz guy on the other side of the table can sense, how eager and desperate Don is to please. And in this case, Perry is just a less polished conveyor of that. And he's pushing every button trying to get Don to buy this painting. And he says, oh, she'll do anything if you buy one from her. He let slip that Midge tracked him down. So he's now confirmed that the chance meeting in the lobby of the building wasn't by chance. Midge was looking to have an encounter with him.
And this realization, this desperation Don is so turned off by, it's a fine line between I'm a really hard worker and I'll do anything. We've seen that be very admirable and focused in the series, but here it's just sad. And as Don realizes that's how their company appears to all their clients, as they're frantically going to meetings and over-explaining how great they are for money, it's a tough realization. And at the same time, he still musters disgust and judgment at these people in front of him in their desperation, even though I think he can see it translating to himself. And here's Midge, a woman who threw a TV out the window. She didn't need traditional things. She was happy. And now she's ashamed that her husband is asking Don for grocery money, and she says he's just going to put it in his arm. So now it's out that they're heroin addicts.
And at this point, Dawn, he asks why she doesn't just stop. She says that she can't. There's a certain irony of that coming from Don Draper because we've seen how trapped he can be in his behavior patterns, and we know he's got his own addiction to alcohol. Don is going to give her some money, and he doesn't want anything back from her in return, but it's pretty clear that he's turned off by this situation. And I think I detect a sadness in him to see that Midge has gone to this place, because I don't think it's where Don Draper thought Midge would end up when they broke up earlier.
When Don gives Midge a check for $300, it feels like a callback to when they broke up before. He got a bonus check from work and he signed it all over to Midge after she wouldn't go to Paris with him. And now she can't even take a check because she doesn't have a bank. She just wants cash, and that's what he's there for. And she's trying to rally that carefree person she was, but she's so dependent on whatever she can get from him. And that's how Betty used to be. So, in a different way. And Don was attracted to her because Midge seemed not to need him. And now here we can feel all of her shame and how this is going nowhere. It's very sad.
It's an interesting contrast in how desire plays as well, because if we think back to their affair, I totally agree with you. One of the things that I think really appealed to Don Draper about Midge was she did have desire for him, but she wasn't desperate. She wasn't needy, and she had alternatives. So she would enjoy the moment with him. Now, fast forward to the present in September of 1965, and Midge is desperate. I get the sense that she still does have legitimate, honest desire for Don Draper, but that is being eclipsed by another need that rules over everything in this moment. And I think we can see it's a total turnoff for Don Draper. So he ends up emptying his wallet for her. But she's so desperate that when he mentions he doesn't now have any car fare, She won't even cough up a couple bucks to him so he can catch a cab to get back to his place. And she suggests that he walk through the park and do some impromptu advertising as he carries the painting.
Midge also tries to bring it back to her creativity and pretend like she's that person she was. She asks, "Do you think my work's any good?" And he won't answer. He just says, "Does it matter?" And he's right. He's buying it because she needs it. He's not buying it for the art. But Don Draper will fish for compliments on his work later in this episode and throughout his life. So to deny that to her right now seems really cruel because he's just refusing to pretend she's the artist she used to be, even though people around him buy into his pretense. He won't do that to somebody else.
It definitely is unkind. I read it. He's very disappointed in where she's found herself, and he's probably feeling some anger and irritation on his side, and that certainly doesn't bring out the best in him. The brutality of it is that it's so true. It doesn't matter in the least. If he gave her twice the money and said, "I hate your painting," she would be twice as happy.
And the last thing Midge says to Don before he leaves is she says, "I'm glad you haven't changed." And that could mean his clothes or his willingness to throw money at problems or his reticence for praise or focus on other people. But I think this episode is really asking, as we look at Don choosing Faye and being honest with people and getting away from alcohol, is he able to change? Is he the same person he always was? And she says that like it's a good thing, like, "Oh, I'm so glad you're the same person." But will he be forever? And wouldn't that also be sad, just as sad as where Midge is?
Yeah, I think there's a bias as, we've been watching this arc of Don Draper's life and hoping for positive change and rooting for the character to make some better choices. This truly is the other side of the coin where, hey, change can be for the worse. And I think Midge has no illusions that her change has been for the worse. Reconnecting with Dawn here has got to bring back the memories of the place she was in previously before this poison got its hooks into her. There's got to be a certain sadness and regret, even if Dawn has stagnated as a human being. She's done something worse than stagnate.
In the next scene, Betty is visiting Dr. Edna, talking about a time when Henry hurt her feelings. And Dr. Edna tries to break up with Betty. She recommends an adult psychiatrist so Betty can talk about all the things she wants to say.
Dr. Edna knew that Betty needed a therapist when she was first introduced to Sally and had set up these sessions with Betty to try and work on things. She doesn't say Betty doesn't need therapy, but she tries to recommend a colleague who could take over and focus on Betty full time and somebody who's not a pediatric psychiatrist. Betty's clever enough to see that coming and won't let go of it. So it's kind of interesting when Sally talked about her survival skill of giving her mother what she wanted. In the end, it seems that Dr. Edna kind of takes the same tact here with Betty.
Betty is a terrible parent here because she isn't focused on Sally at her daughter's psychiatrist meeting. I think, though, we can understand why she might not want to give another psychiatrist a try, given what happened with her first one who betrayed her. And we also saw Henry's reaction to the news that Betty had seen a psychiatrist. So I feel like this is the safest option for Betty to keep the pretense of talking about Sally, but actually getting some support for herself. And I think Dr. Edna rightly recognizes if she can help Betty, that will probably also be helpful to Sally.
I agree with all of that.
In the next scene, we see Don, who's nervous about the Philip Morris presentation. He's running through his tongue twisters. He calls Peggy in to do a couple of overly specific checks. And she reads the situation. She answers his questions, but then she just offers encouragement, which is really what Don needs right now. We hit Peggy pretty hard for not being good with people at the end of season 1, especially when she didn't manage that radio spot with Annie and Rita very tactfully, or she didn't know how to find a roommate without getting teased. But Peggy has come a long way since then. She has really changed and grown. And Don's circumstances have changed. I guess it just remains to be seen whether he has changed and grown or not.
It also feels to me a bit like Dawn is letting the mask slip here. Here's someone who's desperate and nervous and wants to make a good impression and needs some reassurance. And Peggy manages upwards great here and tells him what he needs to hear. It's interesting because this isn't a side of Don Draper that she's seen in the office, and she can really see the human side of him at this moment.
And there's an interesting line here where they're talking about strategy, and she says, nobody switches brands. So, having just come from Midge's, it seems to reinforce this idea that maybe you can't quit the thing that's bad for you, or maybe that people don't change very often. All Don's nervousness turns out to be for nothing because Dr. Atherton appears in the lobby alone. Philip Morris canceled the meeting after all. And it's so depressing. The team is frustrated. It seems to really be a sinking ship.
Not only that, it sounds like Philip Morris has actually leveraged the possibility they might go to someone else with the new brand in order to get a better deal from their current agency. So we can see that mercenary behavior by the clients. They're still looking after their interests. They can make use of the desperation in this room here amongst the principals. And I love the emotional reaction. Roger lashes out at Dr. Atherton. Bert kicks Harry out of the room, so it's only partners around as they're venting their frustration. Again, we can just recognize that, like we saw with Midge and her husband, this desperation, this need, and the disappointment is crushing for them. I feel for the gang in this scene at this moment.
Behind closed doors, Lane says they can get some credit from the bank, but the senior partners need to put up $100,000 for collateral each, and Lane and Pete need to put in $50,000 each to make it happen. And Pete is really worried because he doesn't have the money right now. So things don't look good.
And Lane also gives a time frame saying that doing all of that buys them 6 months of runway being the time that it will take them to burn through their cash reserves and to arrive at a point where they run out of liquidity and are no longer able to keep the lights on.
Next, we go back to Sally and Glen on a different day. Sally is talking about a dream she had where she was flying over London. And she says, when I think about forever, I get upset, which is really interesting to me because I think that's probably true for Don as well. And then Sally shares discomfort about the girl on the Land O'Lakes butter box, which has a picture of another girl holding a box, which has a picture of another girl holding a box. And this infinite box holding, or the sense of being trapped in a pattern, it so fits this episode about whether you can break out of a cycle, whether you can really change for good.
We talked about the earlier scene with Glen where Glen was doing the talking and seeming to try and impress Sally. In this scene, Sally's doing the talking, and Glen seems like a good audience here. He reacts to Sally's comment that she doesn't believe in heaven, and it feels like she's really listening to her. And again, we know in Sally's life that people actually listening to her is a bit of a rarity. But it's probably Grandpa Gene and then Dr. Edna. Now we're with Glen.
It's important Sally has someone to explain her thoughts to because we know Betty and Don are terrible at making time for that. But Glen does not seem to offer very much except his backwash.
Just for the record, I don't want the backwash thing.
Nobody wants his backwash, no.
Nobody wants the backwash.
And maybe that's the idea, that sometimes a person who's around becomes your person because life is lonely. But I wonder, why doesn't Glen have his own friends he's hanging out with? And also, why doesn't Sally have other people? So this is like Peggy choosing Pete for me. I don't understand why Sally wants to spend time with Glen.
Maybe Glen simply represents how low the bar is for Sally in terms of someone who will listen to any degree. And with such a low bar, suddenly Glen becomes a choice or the least bad option. In the category of small things that bother me far more than they should, when Glen finishes the bottle and just chucks it away and we can see all the trash around their little meeting site behind a shed or wherever that they are, it just drives me nuts. I'm thinking, no, children, don't litter. You can recycle that bottle. You can get the deposit for it.
Well, Sally was raised to do that from picnics in years gone by.
Yeah, environmental crime.
Back at the office, Pete goes in to tell Don about how they never had a real chance, that Philip Morris just used them to get a better deal. And Pete also tells Don he doesn't have $50,000 and he's being punished for being the only person getting business. And in this scene, unsurprisingly, Don gives Pete exactly zero comfort or empathy. He says, I'm doing what I can do, okay? Because people are not supposed to complain to Don when the results are bad.
And as we've already discussed, even if he gets in a room and does a great pitch and they sign the client, it's going to be more than 6 months before any of that benefits their bottom line. They are chasing a bit of fool's gold here in terms of we think of cash as oxygen. It's, yeah, maybe you're hungry, maybe you're thirsty, but if you don't have oxygen, none of that matters.
So Pete leaves Don's office and Peggy comes in. And Don is really abrupt. He says, Peggy, it's not your problem. And when she talks to him, it feels like the meeting with Paul about the telegram being permanent, like she's talking off the top of her head and saying something really important. She says, why don't we change our name? Because that's what we would do if it was a dog food company. And she reminds Don, he says, if you don't like what they're saying, change the conversation. And Don is really dismissive. He says, we can't just start over. We just started. And in a truth call out, he says, what they're saying about us is true. But that's the same thing that happened in the pilot, because cigarettes are bad for you and you're not allowed to say otherwise because of the truth, but they're toasted. Then Don found a way to change the conversation, and Peggy reminds him of that.
And also, for the dog food client and how dismissive they were of the client's hesitation to throw away this brand that they had built up over decades. But to them, from a creative perspective, that seemed like the obvious choice. I love the writing here because I think so often in our lives, somebody serves back to us advice that we have previously given out. And perhaps in our emotion or otherwise being weighted down with considerations, we dismiss it or agitate against it in the instant. But then as it soaks in, our own advice fed back to us suddenly starts to sound reasonable or at least something to entertain. And I love the irony of this scene here because Don clearly rejects Peggy's advice in the moment. If you're Peggy walking out of that office, you'd think, well, okay, I guess he's not having any of that.
Pete goes home to Trudy, the baby sleeping, and the bank called about a loan. So Trudy thinks they're getting a house in the suburbs. And we already know Pete is very attached to New York. So this is an argument they are destined to have as a couple. But for now, Pete tells her, actually, he needs the loan to support the company.
And Trudy is not having any of that. And as Pete weakly tries to argue that he does need to put in because he's a partner and he'll lose his partnership if he doesn't comply, it's hilarious when Trudy says, what, you'll lose your stateroom on the Titanic? Insinuating that what's the value of a partnership in a sinking ship? And she's dead on here. And we can see Pete really has nothing to muster against her. So not only does he lack the money, he can't even win the argument about what they should do with the money if they were to suddenly have it. Trudy, for good measure, also throws in that she forbids him asking her father for the money.
I really appreciate that Mad Men gives us characters who argue with valid viewpoints because Trudy is correct. I mean, she is absolutely right to advocate for him getting out while he can and not letting them go into debt. But Pete, being a believer in his company and what he's building, he doesn't want to give up. And that is an admirable stance, especially for somebody who in season 1 and 2 would have sold his soul to do anything to get ahead. And here he is really trying to build something real. I think that both of those points of view we can appreciate, we can understand.
Yeah, I agree. And I think to put further emphasis on that point, as much as there is a liquidity problem in the short run for the firm, it really does seem that it's built on some solid foundations. They've got some decent account people in Ken and Pete. They've got one of the creative geniuses of Madison Avenue and Don Draper. Peggy's an up-and-comer. So they need to survive the short term. But this idea of wagering on the long-term future and success of the company, I think that's a valid position to take. And both Trudy and her father say, hey, this is a sinking ship. You've got options. No need to go down with it. Time for you to jump off, etc. Well, like you mentioned, they're both very valid positions to take, but it becomes very clear that in this relationship, Trudy has an equal voice, and it's going to be a joint decision about what comes next.
Next, we see Don going home by himself. And remember, this is a man who doesn't have family pictures up. He doesn't have artwork. He has nothing personal in his office or in his apartment. These could be anybody's spaces. And again, that's by design, right? So now he has this giant painting he bought from Midge. And he starts to take it outside to get rid of it, I think. And then he starts looking at it. And much later, he's still staring at it with a drink. So he's looking at a painting by an addict while he indulges his addiction. And then Don opens his journal and he rips out all the self-reflection in the front of it. And while he's smoking, he starts writing an editorial called Why I'm Quitting Tobacco.
Through narration, we get the full text of the letter, which ends up being a full-page letter published in the New York Times. So as the scene morphs to the following day, we can see that everyone, starting with Henry at the kitchen table, is reading this full-page ad.
I think this voiceover and scene shifting is so beautifully done, as it starts with Don writing and then editing, and then it shifts to the different people reading it. Don's letter says he's relieved not to be selling a product that harms people. And the key line is, we knew it wasn't good for us, but we couldn't stop. And how much does that apply to pretty much everything in Don's life? We knew it wasn't good for us, but we couldn't stop. And this is classic Don Draper. He pulls ideas from Midge's addiction and unhappiness. He pulls from Peggy reminding him to change the conversation, from Pete's desperation. And of course, the end of the letter has a move forward message. He says, we're certain that our best work is still ahead of us. And this is so much like the carousel speech in The Wheel, too. So Don is drawing on these ideals that our company stands for something. We don't sell cigarettes, just like nostalgia and family are precious, right? He's smoking while he writes this letter, just like he's cheating on his wife and ignoring his family while he waxes on about nostalgia for family photos. It's all about the sale dressed up in something noble. This thing about Don and his conflicts, not the greater good, he can just wear that pretense so much more comfortably than he can show his real self.
Well, and also I like the fact that he got together with all the partners to go over the contents of this letter and this bold move, and everybody's on board and pulling in the same direction.
He's a team player.
Oh, wait a minute. No, he just does this. It's a total cowboy move, which seems very on brand for Don Draper based on what we know. Why doesn't he take a beat to talk with them? Later, when they're confronting him about it, he seems to say that they would have just committed it up, watered it down, and ended up doing nothing and just wallowing in their situation. Whereas he's going to force the issue here. He's to burn the ships, right? So I guess we're here to stay and we're going to have to figure it out.
I think Don really hoped to reclaim his genius hero label here, but he did not think about the consequences for anybody else. And there are a lot of different reasons why different people are upset. Pete points out other clients will think that he will turn on them. Lane says he should have consulted them. And Roger goes, someone used your name to end our business in the newspaper. It's not you, is it? And I thought it was so interesting because there's a moment when Don walks in and Stan says hello to him. And there's no other dialogue. But Stan admires the rebelliousness of the action, no matter what the outcome. So you can see this combination of respect in Stan's hello, but also this sense of, that might be the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And I think Stan's right. I think it's maybe both.
I think there's the generational divide again, right? The young people can go for this striking act of rebellion or resistance. And then the older generation, represented by the principals of the office, they're the most upset about it. And like you say, for a variety of reasons. Bert mentions that, you threw that out there in your name. You didn't even use our name. So we're kind of tied to you, but then we're humiliated because we're not even part of the byline on the statement. And again, these are all very valid points and legitimate. And at this point, Don's got nowhere to go. He can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, I guess.
Megan comes in with a call from Robert Kennedy. And I think you think, as you're watching, that this will be the turning point, that success will prove the other partners are wrong. But it turns out just to be a prank call from Ted Shaw.
It's a pretty rude gesture by Ted, but it seems very on brand for him at this point. Because we know he's been snapping at the heels of Don Draper. And I agree with you as a viewer, I totally fall for the call. And I think it's just, we're used to in our fiction, having these cute type moments where suddenly the clouds part, and then we see the sun shining, and it's all because of his integrity and taking a stance against cancer sticks and all the rest of it. But I love that Mad Men doesn't let us go there and says, no, it's Ted Shaw. And Don ends up hanging up on him.
After that, Bert gets really upset and he says he's leaving the agency. He says they've created a monster in Don. And as they all leave, unhappy with him for publicly criticizing tobacco, Don smokes a cigarette.
I found Megan's comment, he didn't dump me, he being Lucky Strike, I dumped him. It just feels different around here. And I think her point is it's about attitude. And you can mope around and say we got dumped, or you can reframe it to say, no, we dumped him. And I think it's a brave face to put on. Everybody knows that's not really the truth. But when you're talking about marketing and PR and changing the conversation, adhering to the strict truth isn't necessarily required.
Yes, so Megan comes in and gives Don what he wanted from everybody else, and nobody else gave it to him. She gives him praise. She says she loved the letter. She loves that he stands for something. Although we know he didn't do it for that, and he says so. And she says, yes, I know it was the reframe. But this thing about it feels different around the company now, this is the thing. Somebody had to do something. He did change the conversation. He wasn't a team player. You can't trust him. He did not think about the consequences to anybody else. But the one good thing is that at least people are talking about his letter instead of how their company is going under.
Well, I love the next scene when Ken says, hey, the clients aren't talking about Lucky Strike anymore, as Bert makes his farewell, as he goes out of the room.
I love how in the creative lounge, they're already speculating about who's going to get fired. And when Bert comes in to say, it's been a pleasure working with you all, they go, I didn't think they'd start with him. But that is the exact moment when Peggy gets called into Don's office and she has this instant, the room just freezes up because here she goes. She's got this march into his office where, okay, it could happen. She could really be going. And I noticed that Peggy looks really well dressed in this episode. Her dress here is very flattering and feminine, but business appropriate. It looks like Peggy has found herself and her balance right when everything at the agency is chaotic.
Peggy's uncertainty about her future status with the firm, to me, just reeks of how green she is and inexperienced. Because if I look at contributors in that office on a bang for buck perspective, Peggy's at one end of the scale with, I don't know, maybe Roger Sterling at the other end of the scale. In my view or my expectation, Peggy's going to be one of the last people to ever be let go.
Well, Peggy is visibly relieved when she goes into Don's office and learns he actually wants to know who she can cut, not that he's cutting her. Peggy, unlike Megan, doesn't offer an opinion about the letter, but Don asks her for it. Just like she told him she needed to hear thank you once in a while, he needs to hear affirmation here when he's not sure of himself. So you are human after all, Don. And she's not a puppet, so she doesn't feed him a script. She smiles and she says, I thought you didn't go in for those kinds of shenanigans, which is exactly what he told her after her sugarberry ham stunt. And I love that they smile at each other and there's this genuine camaraderie and appreciation for thinking outside the box between them.
It's a great moment. And Don Draper visually says touche because she's got him. In the commentary, Matthew Weiner makes it crystal clear. Don has not suddenly become a crusader against tobacco. And as you pointed out, as he continues to smoke cigarettes himself, he's a crusader to save the agency.
In the next scene, we see Betty driving, and she happens to see Sally walking between some trees and meeting Glen to talk. And Betty freaks out. It's got Mrs. Robinson vibes, even though there was nothing sexual with Betty and Glen or Sally and Glen. And to me, this isn't about Betty being worried about Glen's influence on Sally. It's Betty disliking that Glen pays attention to Sally instead of her.
I love the comedy of Glen bolting when Betty comes out and confronts them. He just drops his Coke and he runs. It's just very funny, and Sally is sort of stuck there with her mother.
Yeah, can we talk about the fact that he was in his football uniform the 2 prior scenes, and he runs about 10 feet and he's winded and he puts his hands on his knees? So I don't know how much value he's contributing to the team, but his running away, I mean, he's not staying. He's not going to stick around to have the showdown with Betty. That's great.
I think Glenn must be on the hamburger squad, okay? He's not playing varsity. It's not the best look for Betty here, as she rather harshly tells Sally to stay away from him and that Glenn is bad and she knows him better than Sally does. And Sally is not taking it. She says back that Betty doesn't know him at all. Betty doesn't really have a comeback, so she just pulls rank and tells Sally she has to go to her room.
And it's weird because Betty does know him better than Sally, and at the same time, she doesn't know him at all. So they're both right. And I think Betty's really uncomfortable when she confronts Sally, and Betty is so upset, and Sally is really calm. And I think all Betty can say is, go to your room, because that's her parent power card. But I think Sally has really unnerved her, right? She's not screaming. She's not throwing a tantrum. She's saying politely, you're wrong.
Yeah, I think we see a real maturity in Sally and how she deals with her mother now, which is a little surprising because Sally has more often than not been kind of a passive victim. And now I think we see real agency in Sally's character. And she's starting to find ways to influence and shape what's happening, to manipulate. And I don't just mean that in a sinister, pejorative sense, but to manipulate and shape Betty's behavior.
And this is a minor hint or spoiler. We know in the next episode, Betty's vanity is going to lead to this major shift that's coming up here. And her decisions probably could have avoided all of what's coming. And here, it's the same. If Betty spent any time with Sally and listened to her, Sally wouldn't be seeking time with Glen. So all this discomfort Betty feels is avoidable and of her own making.
The next scene has us in Dawn's office, where Faye walks in with a box of all her stuff. Dr. Atherton has forced them to resign the account. He doesn't want to jeopardize his lucrative cigarette business by being seen with Sterling Cooper, Draper Price. It's clear that Dawn didn't anticipate this at all or give any thought to the potential impact, and he apologizes to Faye and gives her a kiss. For me, Faye really shows her quality in this scene because there's nothing selfish about her, and she doesn't vent or blame him in any way. She simply shifts the conversation onto their personal relationship and says, hey, tonight we'll have dinner. We're going to talk about anything but work. This is a fair trade. We're free and clear of each other from that professional relationship, which we've seen in the last couple episodes.
I agree. She's a great sport about this, even though you can also see she's disappointed. Honestly, I think she's a hero for having so much goodwill in this moment. I think I'd have a lot more blame to throw at Dawn for messing with my career and not even giving me a heads up.
I think the look on his face in this scene, he's expecting the blowtorch, expecting what the principals gave him earlier in the day. And to her credit, there's none of that at all. She's compartmentalized the professional side and the personal side. And it feels to me like Dawn Draper is having to catch up to where Faye is in terms of her perspective on their relationship.
And not to his credit, I get the sense he didn't think about Faye until he saw her. So he never worried about what the implications would be for her. Along those lines, when Faye is there waiting for Dawn, she sees Dawn walking in with Megan. And they look like a really comfortable pair together, even though it's very business appropriate, and I don't think Faye has any sense about what's gone on between them. But I do think that moment is what prompts Faye to say, have your girl make reservations for their dinner later. She's framing Dawn's relationship with Megan as something insignificant.
Oh, I was gonna say, Faye is confident and has no insecurities about Dawn's secretary. And that's another credit to her that she's not sort of cattishly looking around at potential competition. I hope it works out for her.
Yeah. We all hope. Faye stops by Peggy's office on her way out. And Peggy always puts work first, not the people. So she goes, "Oh no, who's going to do our research?" And it's like, okay, Faye has just lost a really great part of her job. But Peggy does have genuine appreciation for Faye. She says, "You do your job so well and they respect you, and you don't have to play any games." And that reminds us how lonely it is for Peggy professionally and how hard it is to be the only one most of the time. I think Faye's response is kind, but her answer, "Is that what it looks like?" It just reveals that it hasn't been easy for her either. And I feel sad for them that they don't ever get to commiserate. It's like the distance I feel between Peggy and Joan and how I kind of want them to be able to be mentor and mentee. Mad Men doesn't give that to us.
Yeah, I love the writing here because again, I think Faye is playing the games and Faye isn't always respected, and she's having to fight for that day in and day out. But that's not visible to Peggy. Peggy sees the good aspects and perceives Faye as a role model, and I think that's probably appropriate. But at this stage, Peggy doesn't realize you don't get to the end of the race and one day you're respected and accepted and nobody tries to play games. It's a never-ending battle. But I think that's a little off-putting for Faye in this moment because at this very instant, Faye is having to walk off this engagement because of what? The games of Don Draper with the letter, Dr. Atherton's calculus. As you pointed out, Peggy is starving for role models. So this idealized version of Faye is not surprising, but I don't know, perhaps sadly, the gritty reality is far less shiny.
There's a little irony when they shake hands that people believe Peggy slept with Dawn to get ahead professionally, while Faye is sleeping with Dawn, and it has not helped her career.
I also hearken back to the Joey conversation. Remember where he sort of said, Harry was being excessively friendly to him. And I wondered here if Faye was maybe on the watch out for Peggy coming on a little too strong here. And again, there's not really any indication of that, but it feels like Faye's keeping Peggy at arm's distance here in this scene, maybe it's the earlier reasons we talked about, or maybe there's some of this vibe, but I do admit to thinking about Joey and Harry's scene when I was watching this one.
I didn't get any vibe about that particular thing, but I do think Faye has her guard up. And I think, again, that speaks to this idea where I want Peggy and Faye to let their guard down and to sit together and vent about all the things that are ridiculous in the office. But I think Faye's guard serves her pretty well. And she's let her guard down with Dawn, and that has cost her. So I think she's not in a hurry to open up to somebody else in this office. She's just been fired, not completely from her company, but she's lost a really good gig and a big part of it. So she needs to go handle her disappointment, and she can't really act the hero part to somebody else right now.
Yeah, and I think just professionally, Faye needs to cut ties now with Stern Cooper Draper Price. So there's nothing in it for her professionally to maintain any of these connections.
Back at Betty's house, Henry makes a point to come home early to eat with the kids. He is such a good guy. Clearly, Betty told him Sally wanted to eat as a family, and he's here for it. He's showing up, he's investing. Again, such a contrast with Dawn.
And he gets a big plate of overcooked spaghetti noodles covered in sauce and some meatballs. Henry gets to eat the children's food.
Then Betty says to Henry, for Sally's benefit, that the neighborhood is being taken over by low-caliber people, and it's time for them to move. And Henry is thrilled. He's been waiting for this. But then when Sally pushes away from the table, Henry looks worried because he knows there's some hurt, but he doesn't know what it is. And Betty knows she just won that round. So now she can separate Sally from Glen. You just know she was a mean girl in high school. You just do. And then Sally cries on her bed, holding the plastic friendship bracelet Glen left for her when he vandalized their house. So tragic to be leaving him behind. But it is I don't mean to minimize her very real hurt because she does feel manipulated. She does feel invalidated by her mother. And I sympathize.
And as well, Sally doesn't voice any objections at the table. She doesn't have a temper tantrum. She just goes off to mourn and be sad in her room, which I think is on the more mature side of the reaction spectrum here. She's also aware that it's not going to serve anything by kicking and stamping her feet and making a scene in this moment.
Joan would approve. There's a place for that, and it's not in this office. Go home and cry into your pillow. That's exactly what Sally does. Next, the SCDP leadership is getting ready to let staff go to cut costs. It turns out, though, the American Cancer Society called to work with Dawn on an anti-smoking campaign. It's prestigious, but it doesn't come with any money.
Dawn grabs onto it and says, hey, even without the money, it's new work, it's on the air. And the board of the American Cancer Society has, prominent members of the community and the business world. So that's all helpful. Pete can't overcome his sourness at the fact that it's not well-paid work.
And as the meeting breaks up, Pete goes to Lane to explain he does not have the partnership money. So he asks if he can take an advance against a bonus or something. And it turns out Dawn paid Pete's share. One never knows how loyalty is born, right? And Pete is really pleased. This helps him out a lot. He's not violating Trudy's directive. He can still be loyal to the firm. He can keep his savings. And it looks like a nice moment from Dawn and a nice gesture. $50,000 is not insignificant. But I don't know that it makes up for Dawn killing Pete's $4 million North American aviation account.
So to me, this really feels like we're seeing some of the reciprocity here in that Dawn feels there is, if not a debt, then a commitment that Pete has shown to the firm and to him personally. And he's reciprocating here in a very tangible financial way, which, it's a serious sum of money and it's basically mortgage sized for Pete and something he'd have to borrow. Pete doesn't say a word. He just kind of does a silent toast in Dawn's direction, and Dawn knows exactly what he's toasting about. And Dawn just gives the slightest nod back in his direction. And, no word is exchanged between the two of them, but it just feels very gratifying that they've both leaned in towards the success of this firm and supporting the other in moments of need.
As the episode closes, Peggy and Stan are working in the creative lounge, and on either side of the space, different employees are carrying their boxes out. They've been let go. And we see Don looking down the hall. He sees the teary secretary, and he calls in the next person he needs to fire, so he's having to face the pain of other people he's affected. And he feels bad about it, but I think Don would do a lot of it again. There are mistakes I think Don wouldn't make again, like Allison and Adam. I think he would do that differently. But a lot of what's brought him to this point, I'm not sure he can escape, even if he wanted to. Maybe he's comfortable on the Land O'Lakes box after all.
Well, from a professional standpoint, I'm not sure any huge mistakes jump to mind. I mean, in standing up the new firm, they were very dependent upon Lucky Strike. That was the key client that needed to come over. When you're that dependent on a single client, you're always, on the razor's edge when and if that client should depart. Maybe we could argue they needed to more aggressively seek to diversify their business, knowing that the clock was ticking potentially on, Lucky Strike. But they did seem to be, aggressively chasing business. Unfortunate they had to say goodbye to North American because of Don's dark secret. But again, that secret was in place and not something where he really had any choice other than to just risk going through with the background check, which, by the way, I always thought, why couldn't he pass the background check? So many of the references they're checking are from the new Don Draper. It was never apparent to me that he was necessarily going to fail it.
Don's made some other mistakes professionally, too. He threw the temper tantrum with the Jansen clients. He involved himself with Bobby Barrett, for example, with Rachel Mencken. There are just a lot of things along the way that have not really been in the company's best interests, and I think you could argue whether or not this letter was.
I did like Lane's line when he says, "Nobody asked you to euthanize the company."
I think there's so much optimism around building this new company, and I think the audience is so invested in seeing them succeed and watching them claw their way to some form of success. So it's so frustrating and it feels so upsetting. It's like watching them work all weekend for American Airlines and then not even getting to do their presentation.
Yeah, I agree. We get sucked in and we're really rooting for Sterling Cooper, Draper Price. To a lesser extent, I guess, than we root for these flawed characters like a Don Draper. And I keep telling myself, stop rooting for him. You know, he's got all these problems and does things that you don't agree with. I can't help it. Like I'm drawn in by the character, and heaven help me, in some ways I'm rooting for Pete Campbell now, and that really disturbs me because I enjoyed hating him so much on my first watch through of the series. And now as I watch him, I just find myself being much more sympathetic to Pete Campbell's world.
The closing song is by Etta James. The lyrics say, "Trust in me in all you do. Love will see us through if only you trust in me." Is there anything you would trust Don Draper with?
I think he's really solid on creative, but I'm gonna firewall him into that creative world and creating ads for my products. I'm definitely not too keen on him, you know, from a personal standpoint. Definitely don't want to marry him. Not going to date him. He is a cowboy. I mean, this whole letter, that's just a very maverick, rogue thing to do. And if I were partner in that firm, I would be one of the people barking at him the following day. I'm going to resent the lack of collaboration from one of my fellow partners who puts out this public stance against a very big, influential client or industry.
I mean, I might trust him not to be reliable. I can't think of anything consistently. I was trying to think of, oh, is he competitive reliably? Well, not if he's had too much to drink, or not if he's being a baby about the client, or it's really frustrating. But I guess that's what makes him such a great character because human beings are not reliable or consistent all the time. So he's real.
And he does seem to have a personal code, which is interesting. So he doesn't make petty gestures or try to score points at people's expense. You know,
Wait a
he's
minute.
not.
Wait a minute. He doesn't? Doesn't he do that at Peggy? Doesn't he do that at Pete? Doesn't he punch down?
He does. There's certainly those occasions, but there's also moments when he could take advantage of people and he doesn't. And moments where he could, you know, grift and he doesn't. Moments where, you know, he's very quick to open his check and try and throw money at problems to make them go away. And maybe we shouldn't confuse that as a virtue, trying to buy your way out of things. But I get the sense that there's an element of his code there. He's not cheap. He's actually seems rather generous in a number of circumstances where I think a lot of other characters would be way more tight-fisted about it. And again, to me that it's a flawed code, but it hints to me that there is a code in there mixed in with all his various character flaws. And I agree with you. I think that makes him very interesting because if he was all code and no flaws, he would just be this virtuous, you know, artificial person that wouldn't be interesting at all. And if he lacked any sense of code, he would just be so craven and awful that we wouldn't have any sympathy or interest in him. And he's somewhere between those two.
I agree with your larger point about his character, but I'm going to take issue with this idea that him spending money to make problems go away can be considered generosity. For me, that's part of his mask. He does that to avoid emotional intimacy or getting close to people or developing real relationships or admitting wrongdoing. So I think that's a huge part of his shield and mask that's in his own way of his health and his change for good is his use of money.
I don't disagree, but there are plenty of people who will be tight with the money and similarly isolated and emotionally insulated, but they're not going to take any money out of their pocket. They just assume keep it. So he's not doing that, in this particular episode with Midge, he's giving money to a junkie. And I think it would be defensible for him to say, I'm not going to fund your addiction. I'm out of here. And she doesn't have to twist his arm, and he doesn't seek anything in return from her. It's almost, I think, of sense of pity and a charitable sentiment that leads him to give her some money.
I'm still resentful on Betty's behalf that he gave that giant check to Midge instead of buying Betty air conditioning. I'm not over it yet.
Yeah, that's a crazy one too. Yeah, maybe he's just bad at managing his money.
Our next episode coming up is the season finale for season 4, Tomorrowland. Our listener shout out today goes to MD. Thank you so much for your comment and feedback on our episode on YouTube. We appreciate all the positive feedback and 5-star ratings on podcast platforms from our listeners. Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctozee.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.